He called her expired software in front of the entire board, said she was too operational, not strategic enough for the new era. But he forgot one thing: she wrote the compliance system he was about to crash. By the time the chairman read Clause 17C aloud, the billion-dollar merger was already burning. Mason Drake thought pushing her out would clear his path to glory. He never imagined she'd hidden a legal tripwire in the code. This isn't about revenge. It's about watching a man drown in the very system he dismissed. My name is Claire Morrison, and I've spent 12 years making sure Triarch Systems doesn't implode under the weight of its own ambition. Director of Compliance isn't a glamorous title, but when you're the one standing between a software giant and federal prosecution, glamour becomes irrelevant. The boardroom on the 32nd floor still smelled like fresh paint and leather polish when I walked in that Tuesday morning at 9:30 sharp. Thomas Drake, our CEO, sat at the head of the mahogany table, his son Mason lounging in the chair to his right, like he'd already inherited the kingdom. The other directors filed in: Greg from Finance, Patricia from Legal, Howard from Operations. I took my usual seat 3 chairs down on the left and opened my portfolio. "Before we begin," Thomas announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "I want to address some structural changes we're implementing." My pen hovered over the legal pad. In my experience, structural changes meant someone was about to get screwed. Mason straightened his tie. Hermes, of course, and leaned forward. "As you all know, we're entering a critical phase of growth. The market demands innovation, agility, and forward-thinking leadership." His eyes found mine across the table. "Some of our current processes are frankly too operational, not strategic enough for where we're heading." The word operational hit like a slap. I'd heard it before, always wielded by men who confused complexity with inefficiency. My compliance frameworks had saved this company from 3 federal investigations and countless lawsuits. But apparently, that was just operational. "Claire," Thomas said, his voice carrying that false warmth executives perfect over decades, "you've done exceptional work building our compliance infrastructure. Truly exceptional. Here it comes. But Mason has some innovative ideas about integrating AI-driven compliance systems that could revolutionize how we approach regulatory challenges." I kept my expression neutral, a skill honed through hundreds of these meetings. "I'd be interested to hear more about these innovations. Compliance isn't typically an area where you can simply plug in new technology without understanding the underlying regulatory framework." Mason's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding us back, Claire. You're still operating like it's the Sarbanes-Oxley era. We need someone who thinks beyond checkboxes and audit trails." "Checkboxes and audit trails keep us out of federal prison," I replied, matching his smile with my own. "Nobody's dismissing your contributions," Thomas interjected, though that's exactly what they were doing. "We're proposing a transition period. Mason will lead a new strategic compliance initiative, and you'll support the knowledge transfer." Support. Not lead. Not consult. Support. Patricia from Legal shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She knew what this meant. Greg studied his coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. Only Howard met my eyes, and I saw the apology there. "What exactly would this support role entail?" I asked, though I already knew. I'd seen this play before: the gradual erosion of responsibility until you became invisible enough to terminate without fuss. "You'd be our legacy operations integration lead," Mason said, clearly proud of the meaningless title he'd invented, "ensuring our historical systems align with the new framework." Legacy, like I was already a relic. "I see." I closed my portfolio with a soft click. "And when would this transition begin?" "Immediately," Thomas said. "Mason's been working on the framework for months. We're ready to move fast." Months. While I'd been safeguarding their systems, they'd been planning my obsolescence. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd built the very compliance protocols that required them to handle my demotion so carefully. "I appreciate the opportunity," I lied smoothly. "I'm sure Mason's innovations will be illuminating." Mason's smirk widened. He thought he'd won. I'm looking forward to learning from your experience, Claire. The old ways still have some value. Some value. I wanted to tell him about the time I caught a $17 million embezzlement scheme hidden in our Asian subsidiaries' reports, or when I'd identified the security flaw that could have exposed 40 million user accounts. But what was the point? To him, I was just operational overhead, a checkbox ticker past her expiration date. The meeting continued, but I'd stopped listening. My mind was already 3 moves ahead, cataloging every system I'd built, every backdoor I'd documented, every clause I'd written into our compliance framework. They wanted to push me aside, fine. But they'd forgotten something crucial. I'd been here since the beginning. I knew where every body was buried, every shortcut taken, every risk accepted in the name of growth. More importantly, I knew exactly how the systems worked, not just the shiny interfaces Mason would see, but the deep interconnected dependencies that kept everything running. Claire, Thomas's voice pulled me back. We'll need you to brief Mason on the current compliance status by end of week. Of course, I agreed. I'll prepare comprehensive documentation. They had no idea how comprehensive I could be. The meeting adjourned at 10:45. As everyone filed out, Mason paused by my chair. No hard feelings, right? This is just business evolution. Survival of the fittest and all that. I looked up at him, 34 years old, MBA from Wharton, and not a single day of real operational experience. Darwin also said, it's not the strongest that survive Mason. It's the most adaptable. He laughed, mistaking my warning for acceptance. Exactly. That's why we need fresh blood in these roles. Fresh blood. If only he knew how much old blood had been spilled to build what he was so eager to tear down. I gathered my things slowly, letting the boardroom empty. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle stretched out below all glass and ambition. Somewhere in this city, other corporate executions were taking place. Other veterans being pushed aside for younger models who confused disruption with destruction. But I wasn't just any veteran. I was Claire Morrison, and I'd spent 12 years learning exactly how this machine worked. They wanted to replace me. They wanted to call me operational, not strategic. Fine. They were about to learn that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who fights back immediately. It's the one who smiles, nods, and knows exactly which wire to pull to make the whole system collapse. As I walked back to my office, soon to be my former office, I made a mental list. Every contract, every clause, every carefully worded provision I'd embedded in our compliance framework. Thomas and Mason thought they were playing chess, but they'd forgotten who had set up the board. My assistant Jennifer looked up as I approached. She'd already heard, judging by her expression. Claire, I'm so sorry. Don't be, I said, meaning it. Jennifer, I need you to pull all compliance documentation from the past 5 years. Everything. Start with the merger protocols and work backward. Her eyes widened. That's thousands of documents. I know. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd had all morning. We're going to make sure Mason has everything he needs for his new role. Every single detail. Revenge isn't always violent. Sometimes it's standing aside and letting someone fall on the rope you carefully wound and marked. Game on, Mason Drake. Game on. The degradation was surgical precise and wrapped in corporate politeness. Within 48 hours of that boardroom meeting, my access credentials started disappearing like morning mist. First, it was the executive dashboard. Suddenly I needed additional authorization to view real-time compliance metrics I'd designed. Then the C-suite meeting invites stopped arriving. By Friday, my parking spot in the executive garage had been reassigned to optimize space allocation. I sat in my office, still mine for now, watching the systematic dismantling of 12 years' work. My new title, Legacy Operations Integration Lead, appeared in the company directory like a tombstone. Legacy. The word tasted bitter every time I saw it. Claire. Jennifer knocked softly. Mason Drake's assistant just called. He wants to schedule your first knowledge transfer session for Monday at 8 a.m. 8 in the morning. The power play was almost cute in its transparency. Make me come in early, establish dominance. Remind me who was calling the shots now. Tell him I'll be there, I said. And Jennifer, Make sure you've backed up everything we discussed. Use the external drives, not the cloud. She nodded, understanding more than I was saying. Jennifer had been with me for 6 years. She knew when something was off. The weekend passed in a blur of documentation. While Mason probably spent it at his country club, I sat in my home office mapping every connection, every dependency in our compliance systems. People think compliance is just about following rules. They don't understand it's about architecture building frameworks so intrinsically woven into operations that removing them would be like pulling bones from a body. Monday arrived gray and drizzling Seattle's favorite mood. I reached the office at 7:45, coffee in hand, wearing my sharpest suit. If they wanted to bury me, I'd make them do it while I looked impeccable. Mason's new office, of course, he'd already claimed one on the executive floor, screamed of trying too hard. Modern art that cost more than most people's cars, a standing desk he'd probably never use, and a view that pointedly exceeded mine. "Claire," he gestured to a chair across from his desk, not bothering to stand. "Thanks for coming in early. I know you're probably used to more flexible hours." I'd been in the office before 7 a.m., every day for 12 years, but I let it slide. "Happy to accommodate your schedule, Mason." He pulled up a presentation on his massive monitor. "So I've been reviewing our current compliance framework, and honestly, it's like reading hieroglyphics. We need to simplify, streamline, make it more agile." "Compliance isn't meant to be agile," I said carefully. "It's meant to be thorough. Every complexity you see has a reason, usually a federal regulation or a lawsuit we avoided. See, that's the old school thinking we need to move past." He clicked through slides filled with buzzwords and flowcharts that looked impressive but said nothing. "We don't need all these manual checkpoints. AI can handle the heavy lifting." "AI can't testify in federal court," I pointed out. "When the SEC comes knocking, they want to see human judgment, documented decision-making, clear accountability chains." "War stories from the Sarbanes era," he said, using the exact phrase from the meeting. He'd practiced this. "Look, I'm not saying your way was wrong for its time, but it's 2025. We need to think differently." I watched him dismiss 12 years of carefully constructed safeguards with the confidence of someone who'd never faced a federal audit. "Of course. What specific areas would you like me to prioritize for the transition?" "All of it," he said casually, like he was ordering coffee. "But let's start with the merger protocols. Seems like there's a lot of redundancy there." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "The merger protocols are particularly complex. They're tied into multiple systems, legal, financial, operational. Would you like me to create a comprehensive overview?" "Just the highlights. I don't need every little detail about who signed what when." That's exactly the kind of operational minutiae we're trying to eliminate. Operational minutiae. He had no idea that those signatures, those timestamps, those little details were load-bearing walls in our compliance structure. Remove them, and things would start to crumble. But I simply nodded. "I'll prepare something appropriate for your review." The meeting continued for another hour, Mason outlining his vision while demonstrating his profound ignorance of how compliance actually worked. He wanted to leverage blockchain for transparency, without understanding that our regulators barely accepted email. He talked about disrupting the compliance paradigm, as if federal law was a startup competitor we could simply outmaneuver. "One more thing," he said as I gathered my things. "I'll need you to transition your system access to my credentials by end of week. Can't have multiple admins cluttering the framework." "All of my access," I kept my tone neutral. "Well, you'll maintain read-only for the legacy systems you're documenting. But executive right access, that should centralize under the new initiative." He was cutting me off from my own creation. The systems I'd built, the safeguards I'd installed, the careful architecture I'd designed, all of it would be under his control. Or so he thought. "I'll coordinate with IT," I agreed. "Though there are some legacy dependencies that might require maintaining certain permissions. Technical debt, from the early implementations." He waved dismissively. "Whatever you need to do, just make it happen." I left his office at 9:15, my mind racing. He wanted my access, fine. but he clearly didn't understand what he was asking for. Our compliance system wasn't just one program, it was an ecosystem. Dozens of interconnected modules, each with its own dependencies, its own quirks, its own carefully documented history. Back in my soon-to-be former office, I pulled up the system architecture. There, buried in subsection after subsection, were the provisions I'd written over the years. Fallback clauses, contingency protocols, automatic triggers tied to specific conditions. All perfectly legal, all thoroughly documented, all invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The next few days blurred together in a parade of humiliations. My nameplate disappeared from the conference room where I'd led weekly compliance reviews. My direct reports were told to start copying Mason on all communications. The executive assistant who'd always greeted me by name now looked through me like I was furniture. But the worst came Thursday afternoon. I was documenting handover protocols when Mason appeared in my doorway with two younger employees I didn't recognize. "Claire, meet Brad and Stephanie from our innovation lab. They'll be shadowing you to understand the legacy systems." Brad, who looked about 12, immediately started critiquing my documentation format. "Why are you using PDFs? Nobody uses PDFs anymore. Everything should be in collaborative cloud docs." "PDFs maintain formatting and create unchangeable audit trails," I explained patiently. "When federal investigators request documentation, they want to see what existed at a specific point in time, not a living document that's been edited 17 times. Stephanie laughed. Actually laughed. "Federal investigators, God. You sound like my mom talking about backing up to floppy disks." Mason didn't correct them. If anything, he looked amused. "Claire's giving us the historical perspective. It's valuable to understand how things used to be done." Used to be done. As if federal compliance law had changed because some children decided PDFs were uncool. "Right," I said, my smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Historical perspective. Like how we avoided that $27 million fine in 2022 because our legacy documentation proved we'd followed protocols that your innovation lab would have considered too slow." The color drained from Mason's face. He'd forgotten about that fine, or more likely never knew about it. It had been handled quietly, professionally, the way real compliance work happened. Not in flashy presentations, but in careful documentation and midnight reviews of federal requirements. "Well," he said, recovering quickly, "that's exactly why we need to modernize. Those kinds of near misses shouldn't happen with proper systems." Near miss. We'd avoided the fine entirely because of my systems, but I didn't correct him. I was done teaching. Let him learn the hard way. "Of course," I agreed. "Brad, Stephanie, why don't I show you the basic architecture? I'm sure you'll find ways to improve it." I spent the rest of the afternoon watching them dismiss 12 years of work as overcomplicated and redundant. They had no idea that every redundancy existed because somewhere, sometime, a single point of failure had nearly cost us everything. But I smiled and nodded and documented everything they said. Every dismissive comment, every ignored warning, every protocol they planned to eliminate. By 4:30 they were gone, eager to return to their ping-pong tables and artisanal coffee bars in the innovation lab. I stayed until 8, methodically completing my documentation. Not the simplified highlights Mason wanted, but the real thing. Every system, every dependency, every carefully placed fail-safe, including the ones he'd never think to look for. As I finally packed up for the night, I allowed myself one small smile. They thought they were degrading me, pushing me aside, making me irrelevant. They had no idea they were handing me exactly what I needed: time access and the perfect cover of being considered too operational, too legacy, too harmless to matter. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late. But that realization wouldn't come from me shouting or fighting or making scenes. It would come from their own choices, their own dismissals, their own arrogant assumptions. After all, I was just operational. And everyone knows operations don't matter in the brave new world of strategic innovation. Until they do. The email that changed everything arrived at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was home, supposedly disconnected from work, but old habits die hard. The sender was Bryce Coleman, our CFO, and he'd forgotten to BCC me off a thread I'd been monitoring through our legal compliance channels. The subject line was innocuous, Project Pegasus, Final Terms Review. But the attachment made my blood run cold. Triarch Systems was in advanced negotiations to merge with Orionics Technologies, a deal valued at $1.1 billion. The timeline showed final approval in 6 weeks. I sat back in my home office chair processing the implications. A merger of this scale would require extensive compliance oversight, federal approvals, SEC filings, integration protocols that touched every system I'd built. And Mason Drake, according to the org chart attached to the email, was designated as Integration Officer. Mason, who thought PDFs were outdated. Mason, who wanted to replace careful documentation with AI. Mason, who'd been on the job for exactly 11 days. I pulled up my secure laptop, the one IT didn't know about, and began my research. Every merger leaves breadcrumbs in the digital trail if you know where to look. SEC preliminary filings, vendor communication patterns, unusual spikes in legal billing. By 3 a.m, I had a clear picture. The merger was further along than the email suggested. They'd been planning this for months, probably before they'd decided to push me aside. The timing wasn't coincidence. They needed someone pliable in the compliance role, someone who wouldn't ask hard questions about integration shortcuts or regulatory corners cut in the name of speed. But they'd made a critical error. In their rush to sideline me, they'd left me with 2 more weeks of system access. 2 weeks might as well have been 2 years for someone who knew these systems like I did. I started my work methodically. First, I printed everything old school, yes, but paper couldn't be remotely deleted or tracked through digital forensics. Every version of every compliance protocol, every update log, every change management record. My home office began to look like a law library. Next, I began the delicate process of extracting my fingerprints from recent system updates while preserving the historical record. This wasn't destruction or sabotage. I was simply creating clear documentation of what existed before Mason's innovation began. If anyone asked, I was preparing thorough transition documentation exactly as requested. The real treasure came when I dove into our contract management system. Over the years, I'd built in numerous safeguards and contingency clauses buried in subsections and appendices that no one ever read. Most were standard fallback provisions for system failures, chain of custody protocols, for sensitive data succession planning for key roles. But there in the merger integration protocols last updated in March, I found what I was looking for. Section 17. Subsection C, hidden in the middle of a 72-page document about technical integration standards. I'd written it after our last failed merger attempt, when a compliance failure had nearly triggered SEC sanctions. The clause was elegant in its simplicity. If the designated integration officer changed within 10 business days of the final audit submission, all compliance liability would transfer to the replacement, not the company. It was designed to prevent last-minute scapegoating, ensuring accountability stayed with the person who'd actually overseen the process. I read it 3 times, then checked the metadata. Clean. Approved by legal, signed off by the board, integrated into our standard merger protocols 9 months ago. No one had touched it since. Mason had been integration officer for 11 days. If he stayed in the role through the merger, he'd be fine. But if something happened, if he decided to shift blame or bring in a fall guy when things got complicated, the clause would activate. All the risk, all the liability would follow whoever held the title when the music stopped. I leaned back, considering my options. I could flag this for leadership, warn them about the potential risk. The old Claire would have done exactly that, rushed to protect the company to prevent disaster. But the old Claire hadn't been called expired software. The old Claire hadn't watched 12 years of work dismissed as operational minutia. Instead, I did what they'd asked me to do. I documented everything meticulously. I created comprehensive guides for every system, every protocol, every safeguard. I even highlighted Section 17C in my handover notes, marking it clearly as Critical Merger Protocol, requires review. If Mason read it, he'd understand the risk. If he dismissed it as more legacy overthinking, well, that was his strategic decision to make. Thursday morning, I submitted my documentation. 347 pages of detailed transition notes organized perfectly indexed comprehensively. I even included an executive summary for Mason's convenience, though I suspected he'd skip straight to the PowerPoint Brad and Stephanie were preparing. Jennifer helped me box up my personal items that afternoon. After 12 years, it didn't amount to much. Some awards photos from company events, a cactus that had somehow survived despite my black thumb. "You're not even fighting this," she said quietly, wrapping my coffee mug in newspaper. "It's not like you." I smiled, thinking of the USB drive in my pocket containing every email, every document, every piece of evidence that might become relevant later. Sometimes the best fight is knowing when not to throw a punch. "But they're stealing your work. Everything you built is documented thoroughly and handed over as requested." I finished. "What they do with it is their responsibility." She looked unconvinced, but I couldn't explain further. The beauty of a good contingency plan is that no one knows it exists until it's too late to stop it. My last official meeting was Friday at 4 p.m. Mason had graciously agreed to a final transition review, though he spent most of it checking his phone. "This all looks very thorough," he said, scrolling past my careful documentation. Though honestly, Claire, 300 pages were trying to streamline, not write novels. "I wanted to ensure complete knowledge transfer," I replied evenly. "Every detail that might become relevant is included." "Right, well, we'll keep it on file if we need to reference anything." He closed the document without reading past the executive summary. "I think Brad and Stephanie have captured the essential elements in their innovation framework." "I'm sure they have," I agreed. "Though you might want to pay particular attention to Section 17 of the merger protocols, given your role as integration officer." He waved dismissively. "Legal's handling all that. My focus is on the technology integration, not getting bogged down in contract language." I nodded, making a mental note of his response, witnessed by his assistant who was taking minutes. Documented. Time-stamped. "Well then," I stood, extending my hand. "Best of luck with the integration." His handshake was perfunctory, already dismissing me. "Thanks for your service, Claire. Enjoy your next chapter." I walked out of Triarch Systems at 4:37 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, carrying my cardboard box like a corporate cliché. Security collected my badge, my parking pass, my corporate credit card. They were professional about it, even sympathetic. I'd helped most of them over the years, ensuring their overtime was properly documented, their benefits correctly administered. "Take care, Ms. Morrison," the head of security said quietly. "You'll be missed around here." "Thank you, Carl." I smiled genuinely. "Take care of yourself." I drove home through Seattle traffic, my box of memories in the back seat. 12 years reduced to a cardboard container and a USB drive. But also to something else, a perfectly legal clause in a thoroughly documented protocol sitting like a landmine in the middle of a billion-dollar deal. Mason thought he'd won. Thomas Drake thought he'd smoothly transitioned out a troublesome executive. The board thought they'd modernize their compliance function. None of them understood that in compliance, the real power isn't in what you build. It's in knowing how it can fall apart. And I just handed them the rope, carefully coiled and labeled with detailed instructions on exactly how to hang themselves. All they had to do was be themselves, arrogant, dismissive, too strategic to bother with operational details. I pulled into my driveway as the sun set behind the Olympics, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside my home office, I filed away my documentation, locked the USB drive in my safe, and poured myself a very good glass of wine. The game was no longer mine to play. I'd made my moves, placed my pieces, documented every step. Now it was just a matter of waiting. In 6 weeks, Triarch Systems would either complete their merger smoothly, or Mason Drake would discover exactly why operational minutiae mattered. Either way, I'd fulfilled my obligations, completed my transition, handed over everything they'd asked for. The fact that they'd never asked the right questions, well, that was hardly my fault. I raised my glass to the sunset, toasting silently to Section 17C, and the beauty of malicious compliance. Sometimes revenge isn't about what you do, it's about what you let other people do to themselves. March had been a different world. I remembered it clearly as I sat in my home office reviewing the digital breadcrumbs of my past work. Back then, I'd still believed in the company, still thought my value would be recognized. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very diligence they now mocked had planted the seeds of what was coming. It had started with the Brennan Industries deal, our last failed merger attempt. The integration had gone sideways when our hastily appointed compliance officer, a strategic thinker much like Mason, had missed critical regulatory filings. The SEC had descended like vultures, and only my weekend intervention had prevented a catastrophic fine. But the near miss had taught me something valuable. In mergers, accountability was fluid, shifting like smoke unless you nailed it down. So I'd written Clause 17C. The beauty of corporate documentation is that no one reads it. They trust their lawyers to handle the details, their compliance officers to manage the risk. And in March, I'd been both trusted and invisible enough to update our standard merger protocols without fanfare. The clause itself was a masterpiece of precision. Embedded in subsection C of Section 17, surrounded by mind-numbing technical specifications about data integration and system compatibility, it read, "In the event of a change in the designated integration officer, within 10 business days of the final compliance audit submission, all regulatory liability and fiduciary responsibility shall transfer automatically to the successor, including but not limited to any pre-existing conditions, errors, or omissions in the integration process. This transfer is irrevocable and supersedes any other indemnification agreements." I'd even added a rationale in the annotations preventing last-minute scapegoating, ensuring continuity of accountability, protecting the company from bad actors who might try to dodge responsibility. Legal had loved it. The board had approved it without question. After all, who would be stupid enough to change integration officers in the final days of a billion-dollar merger? Mason Drake, apparently. The folder on my desk contained everything: time-stamped emails, approval chains, the full audit trail of Clause 17C's creation and implementation. All perfectly legitimate, all thoroughly documented, all waiting in what I'd labeled legacy fallback provisions in the system architecture I'd handed over. The true genius wasn't in hiding it. It was in putting it exactly where it belonged, labeled correctly, indexed properly, even highlighted in my transition notes. If Mason or his innovation team had bothered to read past the executive summary, they'd have seen my note: "Critical provision for merger accountability requires strategic review." But I knew they hadn't read it. How did I know? Because I'd embedded a simple tracking pixel in the document, the kind marketers use to see if emails get opened. Old-school operational thinking, the kind Mason would mock. The pixel had fired once for exactly 37 seconds, just long enough for him to scroll to the PowerPoint summary Brad and Stephanie had prepared. The physical folder I'd kept was my insurance policy. Every document printed on the old printer in my home office, the one I'd bought with my own money, leaving no digital trail in Triarch systems. Call it paranoid. But I'd learned long ago that when corporate politics turn ugly, the person with paper wins. I pulled out the crown jewel, the email chain from March 23rd. Thomas Drake himself had signed off on the protocol update, praising my attention to detail and forward-thinking risk management. Mason had been CC'd on the approval. Had he read it then? The tracking showed no. He'd been too busy planning his innovation initiative to pay attention to operational minutiae. The metadata told its own story. Created by Claire Morrison, March 23, 2025 at 9:47 p.m. Last modified by Claire Morrison, March 24th. At 2:15 a.m., after legal's review incorporating their suggested language to make it even more ironclad. Approved by legal, March 26th. Approved by the board, March 30th. Integrated into standard merger protocols, April 2nd. No changes since then. No amendments, no revisions, no challenges. It had become part of Triarch's DNA, as fundamental as any other compliance requirement. And why would anyone question it? It was a sensible provision protecting the company from exactly the kind of last-minute maneuvering that had almost sunk the Brennan deal. I created a new folder, Contingency Documentation. Into it went copies of everything: the original clause, the approval chains, the integration into merger protocols, my transition notes highlighting its importance. I even included a copy of the email where Mason had dismissed reviewing Section 17 as legal's problem. The USB drive I'd prepared was more than just backup. It was a time capsule preserving the state of our compliance systems before Mason's improvements. Every protocol, every safeguard, every carefully constructed framework that he was about to optimize into oblivion. All of it time-stamped, all of it authentic, all of it waiting. But the real masterstroke was what I'd done in those final days with system access. I'd updated the merger protocol index, adding a new flag to Clause 17C, automatic trigger upon officer change. Not changing the clause itself that would have been tampering, just properly categorizing what already existed, ensuring the system would recognize when conditions were met. It was the kind of detail work Mason would never notice. Too operational, too in the weeds. But when the merger hit its final stages, when the compliance audits ran their automated checks, that flag would ensure Clause 17C couldn't be missed or ignored. I'd even tested it in the sandbox environment, running simulations of officer changes at various merger stages. The results were consistent: change officers within 10 days of final audit, and the system would automatically update all liability assignments. No manual intervention required. No way to stop it once triggered. The timestamp on that configuration was beautiful: April 15, 2025, at 4:33 p.m. My last day. My last official act as Director of Compliance. Ensuring our systems would properly execute board-approved protocols exactly as designed. In my filing cabinet, I found the physical copy of the original March update, still bearing the wet signatures of legal approval. Paper, ink, real. In an age of digital everything, physical documents carried weight in court. They couldn't be claimed as forgeries or system glitches. They were tangible proof of what had been decided when and by whom. I photographed each page with my personal phone backing up the backup. Paranoid maybe. But I'd seen too many convenient system failures, too many mysteriously missing emails, too many corrupted files to trust digital storage alone. The final piece of my documentation was a simple timeline. March clause created and approved. April integrated into systems. May Mason appointed integration officer. And then, nothing. Yet. But the timeline had room for more entries. Space for whatever came next. I locked everything in my personal safe, the one that had survived my father's house fire 20 years ago. Fireproof, waterproof, and completely outside Triarch's reach. The USB drives went into a safety deposit box at a bank Triarch didn't use. The cloud backups were stored on servers in Iceland, paid for with cryptocurrency, accessible only through encryption keys I'd memorized. Was it overkill, perhaps? But I'd learned that in corporate warfare, the winner is usually the one who kept the best records, and I had 12 years of practice in documentation. As I closed the safe, I thought about Mason Drake, probably at some trendy bar celebrating his conquest of the compliance department. He had no idea that his kingdom had come pre-mined, that the very foundations contained a provision that could transfer every ounce of merger liability directly to his shoulders. All he had to do was stay integration officer through the merger. Simple, easy, nothing to worry about if he did his job properly. But if he tried to shift blame when things got complicated, if he attempted to bring in a scapegoat when the integration hit its inevitable snags, if he decided at the last minute that being integration officer was too much operational responsibility for a strategic thinker, Clause 17C would be waiting, patient as a spider, twice as deadly and completely, thoroughly, unimpeachably legal. I poured myself another glass of wine and opened my personal laptop. Time to update my resume. Not because I needed a job, my severance was generous and I had savings, but because when this played out, when the business journals wrote about the merger, I wanted to be somewhere far away building something new. Let Mason have his innovation. Let him optimize and streamline and leverage whatever buzzwords were trending. I'd given him everything he needed to succeed or to hang himself. The choice would be his. But the rope. The rope was mine, woven from policy and procedure, strengthened by legal approval, and tied with a knot that would only tighten under pressure. Clause 17C, my farewell gift to Triarch Systems. Hidden in plain sight, documented thoroughly, and waiting for someone to pull the wrong thread. I closed my laptop and raised my glass to the empty room. To operational thinking, I said quietly. May it outlive us all. The unraveling began exactly as I'd predicted, not with a bang, but with a whimper in Mason's voice when he called me at 6:45 p.m. on a Wednesday. Claire. He sounded different. Gone was the corporate conquistador who'd dismantled my department. I know this is unusual, but I'm hoping you might be available for some consulting work. I was making dinner phone on speaker, stirring pasta, with the same calm precision I'd once applied to federal audits. Consulting, I thought Brad and Stephanie had everything well in hand with their innovation framework. A pause. I could practically hear him grinding his teeth. They've been reassigned to other projects. Listen, some unexpected complexities have come up with the merger integration. Unexpected complexities. Corporate speak for everything's on fire and we don't know why. I see, I said neutrally. What kind of complexities? Some of our legacy systems aren't integrating properly with Orionics's infrastructure. There are compatibility issues we didn't anticipate. Legacy systems, the ones he'd dismissed as outdated just 6 weeks ago. I added salt to the boiling water, taking my time before responding. That's unfortunate, though I believe I highlighted several potential integration challenges in my transition documentation. Section 12, if memory serves. Right, yes. The thing is, we need someone who really understands these systems. Someone who can move quickly. Quickly. I allowed a hint of concern to creep into my voice. The merger timeline hasn't accelerated, has it? You're still targeting the original completion date. Another pause, longer this time. There's been some pressure to expedite. The market conditions are optimal right now, and both boards want to capitalize. Of course they did. Nothing drove bad decisions quite like the fear of missing a market window. I appreciate you thinking of me, Mason, but I'm not sure I'm the right fit. You need someone strategic, not operational. Claire, please. The desperation was palpable now. I know things ended poorly, but we need your expertise. I need your expertise. I turned off the stove, giving him my full attention. What exactly would this consulting arrangement entail? Full access restoration, competitive hourly rate work from wherever you want. Just help us get through the merger integration. And my role would be consultant, advisor, whatever title you prefer. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Not integration officer. A sharp intake of breath. There it was, the trap revealing itself. If he brought me back as integration officer, I'd inherit all the problems he'd created. But more importantly, he'd trigger Clause 17C, transferring all liability to me as the replacement within the 10-day window. No, he said quickly, too quickly. You'd be consulting to support my role as integration officer. So he had read at least some of the documentation. Or more likely, legal had flagged it when the integration started hemorrhaging. But understanding the trap and avoiding it were two different things. I'll need to think about it, I said. Send me a formal consulting agreement and I'll review it. How long do you need? We're really under the gun here. Under the gun. If only he knew how literally true that was. 48 hours should be sufficient. Though, Mason, you might want to review Section 17 of the merger protocols yourself, particularly subsection C, just to ensure we're aligned on responsibilities. The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, I've reviewed it. Good. Then you understand why clarity on roles is essential. After I hung up, I finished making dinner and poured myself a glass of wine. The consulting offer was tempting not for the money, but for the front row seat to watch the disaster unfold. But taking it would mean helping him avoid the consequences of his own arrogance. And where was the justice in that? The formal offer arrived the next morning. I read it over coffee, noting the careful language around responsibilities and liabilities. Someone in legal had definitely coached him. But they'd made a crucial error in their eagerness to protect Mason. They'd explicitly stated that all integration officer duties and liabilities would remain solely with him. Beautiful. They'd just created a paper trail confirming he understood and accepted the risks. I waited the full 48 hours before responding. Professional, courteous, and declining. After consideration, I don't believe I can add value to your innovative approach to compliance integration. I'm confident your team has the strategic vision to navigate any challenges. Best wishes for a successful merger. The call started within an hour. Mason, then Greg from finance. Even Thomas Drake himself, though his voicemail was carefully worded to avoid admitting they needed me. I didn't return any of them. Instead, I watched from afar as the integration began to implode. Through my network, 12 years, builds a lot of relationships. I heard about vendor payments failing because the simplified approval chains had removed crucial verification steps. Data synchronization errors because the redundant validation protocols had been eliminated. Regulatory flags because the overcomplicated reporting mechanisms had been streamlined into uselessness. The business press started picking up whispers. Technical challenges in the Triarch Orionics merger. Integration delays, pushing timelines. Stock prices began to wobble. Then 3 weeks before the final compliance audit was due, Jennifer called me. She was whispering, calling from her car during lunch. "Claire, you won't believe what just happened. Mason had a complete meltdown in the executive meeting. He actually threw his laptop." "That seems out of character," I said carefully. "He's trying to bring in someone else as integration officer. Some hotshot from McKinsey, but legal shut it down hard. Apparently there's some clause that would make the new person liable for everything. Clause 17C, doing exactly what it was designed to do." Interesting. And Mason's response? He stormed out. But here's the thing, Thomas Drake looked terrified, like actually pale. "What do you think is really going on?" I knew exactly what was going on. The merger was failing, and when it collapsed, someone would need to take the blame. SEC investigations, shareholder lawsuits, potentially criminal liability if any regulations had been violated. And thanks to Clause 17C, Mason couldn't pass that burden to anyone else. "Corporate mergers are complex," I said diplomatically. "I'm sure they'll sort it out." But they wouldn't sort it out, because the beautiful thing about systematic failure is that once it starts, it compounds. Every shortcut Mason had taken, every safeguard he'd eliminated, every protocol he'd simplified, they were all combining into a perfect storm of corporate disaster. The next week, the news broke officially. Triarch Orionics merger in jeopardy, due to compliance failures. The article was damning, citing anonymous sources about integration chaos and regulatory concerns. Mason Drake was named specifically as the integration officer overseeing the troubled process. My phone rang again. This time I recognized the number: Harvey Brightman, Triarch's chief legal counsel. "Claire, we need to talk, in person, today." "I'm no longer a Triarch employee, Harvey." "This isn't about employment. This is about clarifying some historical documentation." Historical documentation. They'd finally understood the full implications of Clause 17C. "I'm happy to meet. My attorney will accompany me, of course." "Your attorney?" His voice sharpened. "Claire, there's no need for—" Given that I'm being asked to discuss historical documentation related to a failing billion-dollar merger, where I've been publicly identified as the former compliance officer, I think there's every need. The meeting was scheduled for the next day. I chose my outfit carefully, the same sharp suit I'd worn on my last day, the one that said professional, but also dangerous. My attorney, Margaret Chen, was even sharper. She specialized in corporate liability and whistleblower protections. Watching Harvey's face when we walked in was worth the price of Margaret's hourly rate. He'd expected the operational Claire, the helpful Claire, the Claire who fixed problems quietly. Instead, he got the Claire who'd spent 12 years learning exactly how corporate law worked. "We're hoping you can provide some context around certain merger protocols," Harvey began carefully. Specifically Clause 17C, I asked innocently. His eye twitched. Among other provisions. Margaret interjected smoothly. My client is happy to discuss any publicly filed documents. However, any consultation regarding proprietary Triarch information would require a formal agreement including appropriate compensation and indemnification. This is simply about clarification. Of a clause my client drafted had approved through proper channels and thoroughly documented in her transition materials. Margaret smiled sharply. A clause that was in place for 9 months before the current integration officer assumed his role. I'm not sure what clarification is needed. Harvey looked like he'd swallowed glass. There are questions about the intent behind the clause. I leaned forward slightly. The intent is clearly documented in the annotation. Preventing last-minute scapegoating, ensuring continuity of accountability, protecting the company from bad actors. I believe the board praised it as forward-thinking risk management. But the specific trigger mechanisms are exactly as designed and approved, Margaret interrupted. Unless you're suggesting the board didn't understand what they were approving. Check and mate. Either the clause was valid as written or the entire board was negligent in their oversight. Harvey knew it, I knew it, and most importantly, Margaret knew it. The meeting ended with vague promises to be in touch. But I knew they had no moves left. Clause 17C was ironclad, properly approved, and about to deliver exactly what it promised: accountability that couldn't be shifted or avoided. 3 days later, Mason Drake resigned as integration officer, citing personal reasons. But it was too late. The resignation came within the 10-day window. The clause had already triggered. The liability was his. I made myself another cup of coffee and opened my laptop to check the news. The merger had officially collapsed. The SEC had announced an investigation. And Mason Drake, the strategic visionary, who'd been too important for operational details, was about to learn why compliance wasn't about checkboxes. It was about consequences. The vendor payment failure started small, a delayed wire transfer here, a missing approval there. But in the interconnected world of corporate finance, small failures cascade like dominoes. By the second week of June, Triarch's carefully orchestrated merger was hemorrhaging from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. I learned the details through my network of former colleagues, each one reaching out with a mixture of panic and disbelief. The stories painted a picture of systematic collapse that even I hadn't anticipated. First came the duplicate payments. Mason's streamlined approval process had removed what he called redundant verification steps. But those steps existed because our Hong Kong office operated on different banking hours than Seattle. Without the built-in delays, the system processed payments twice, once when Hong Kong initiated them, once when Seattle confirmed them 16 hours later. $37 million in duplicate vendor payments in a single week. Then the data synchronization errors bloomed like digital cancer. The validation protocols I'd spent 3 years refining hadn't been redundant, they'd been load-bearing. Without them, customer data from Orionics began corrupting Triarch's databases. Not obviously at first, just minor discrepancies in billing addresses, phone numbers off by a digit. But when those errors hit the financial reporting systems, chaos followed. Sarah from Accounts Receivable called me on a Tuesday night, her voice shaking. "Claire, we can't reconcile anything. The customer data doesn't match the billing systems don't match the bank records. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where someone keeps changing the pieces." "What does Mason say?" I asked, though I could guess. "He brought in some AI tool that's supposed to fix everything. It made it worse. Now we have 3 different versions of every customer record and no way to tell which is correct." The beautiful irony was that every problem had been preventable. Every single failure point had been identified in my transition documentation. Page 247. Data synchronization requires triple validation due to time zone discrepancies. Page 189. Vendor payment protocols include mandatory cooling-off periods to prevent duplicate processing. Page 72. Customer data integrity depends on maintaining separate validation streams for each merger entity. But why read 347 pages of operational minutia when you could innovate? The regulatory flags started appearing in week 3. The SEC's automated monitoring systems began catching discrepancies in Triarch's merger filings. Nothing dramatic, just enough inconsistencies to trigger manual review. And manual review meant human eyes on the process, human eyes that would notice the corners being cut, the protocols being ignored, the safeguards being streamlined out of existence. Marcus from Legal called me at 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, drunk and desperate. "Claire, please. I know you don't owe us anything, but we need help. The SEC is asking questions we can't answer. They want documentation for approval processes that don't exist anymore." "They don't exist because Mason eliminated them," I said evenly. "I know. God, I know. But there has to be something you can do. Some way to fix this." "Marcus, you can't fix systematic dismantling with a Band-Aid. Every shortcut taken, every process eliminated, every safeguard removed, they're all compounding. It's not one problem, it's 1,000 problems wearing a trench coat." "Then what do we do?" I could have felt sorry for him. Marcus was a good lawyer, competent and thorough. But he'd sat in those meetings while they dismantled my department. He'd reviewed the innovation framework that replaced 12 years of carefully constructed compliance infrastructure with buzzwords and AI promises. "You do what the system demands," I said. "You document everything. You report accurately to the SEC. You let the process play out according to the regulations you're supposed to follow." "That could kill the merger." "The merger is already dead, Marcus. You're just arguing about who signs the death certificate." The nail in the coffin came from an unexpected source, Brad from the Innovation Lab. Apparently his enthusiasm for disruption had limits, and those limits were federal investigators. He'd quietly begun documenting every decision, every corner cut, every time Mason had overruled concerns about compliance protocols. The documentation Brad compiled was damning, but it was his email trail that truly sealed Mason's fate. Email after email, showing Mason dismissing concerns, mocking legacy thinking, ordering the elimination of safeguards despite warnings, all time-stamped, all authenticated, all proving a pattern of willful negligence. The error that finally broke everything was almost poetic in its simplicity. In their rush to integrate systems, Mason's team had connected Orionics's financial reporting directly to Triarch's SEC filing system. No buffer, no validation, no human review. Just raw data flowing from one system to another, trusting that everything would align. It didn't align. On June 21st, at 4:15 a.m., Pacific Time, Triarch's automated systems filed an SEC report showing revenue discrepancies of over $300 million. The filing was live for exactly 17 minutes before someone noticed, but 17 minutes in the digital age might as well be 17 years. The SEC's Enforcement Division arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. I was gardening when Jennifer called with the news. "They're here. Actual federal investigators. They've locked down the executive floor and they're seizing computers." "Stay calm," I advised, though my heart was racing. This was beyond what I'd expected. "Cooperate fully. Answer only what they ask. And Jennifer, make sure your personal devices are clean." "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know. But right now, everyone who touched the merger is under scrutiny." The investigation moved with federal efficiency. Within hours, they'd identified the systematic failures, the removed safeguards, the ignored protocols. And at the center of it all was Mason Drake, Integration Officer, whose signature appeared on every decision that had led to this moment. That evening, as I was making dinner, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a familiar figure, Janice Patel, the young woman who'd taken over my compliance manager role. She looked exhausted, defeated, and very, very young. "Ms. Morrison, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I need help." I let her in, noting the manila folder clutched in her hands. "What's wrong, Janice?" "Everything. The investigators are asking about protocols. I've never seen systems I don't understand. Mason told me you'd left everything in chaos, that your documentation was outdated and useless. But that's not true, is it?" I made her tea while she composed herself. "What's in the folder?" "Something I found in the system. Mason told me to delete all the old compliance documentation, said we needed a clean slate. But I couldn't do it. It felt wrong, so I archived it instead. She opened the folder, revealing printed screenshots. This morning I found this. It was Clause 17C, highlighted in my transition notes, with the annotation, Critical Merger Protocol, requires strategic review. Time-stamped, authenticated. Proof that I'd done everything possible to warn them. Janice, I said carefully, what you have there is very important. The investigators need to see it. But it proves Mason knew, that he ignored the warnings, that he understood the risks and proceeded anyway. Yes, I agreed, it does. She looked at me with dawning understanding. You knew this would happen. You set this up. I documented existing protocols and ensured they were properly integrated into our systems, I corrected gently. What Mason chose to do with that information was his decision. But you knew he'd ignore it. You knew he'd trigger the clause. I sipped my tea, choosing my words carefully. I knew that someone who dismissed 12 years of operational experience as legacy thinking might not give proper weight to operational safeguards. But Janice, I didn't make him ignore the warnings. I didn't make him cut corners or eliminate protocols. I simply ensured that when decisions were made, there would be accountability. She stared at the papers in her hands. What do I do? You do your job. You provide the investigators with all relevant documentation. You tell the truth. And you learn from this compliance isn't about making friends or being seen as strategic. It's about protecting the company even from itself. Janice left an hour later, folder in hand, determination replacing defeat. She'd make a good compliance officer someday if she survived this. The next morning, the business news exploded. Triarch Systems merger collapses amid federal investigation. Mason Drake was named, prominently identified as the integration officer responsible for the failed systems consolidation. The article detailed the systematic dismantling of compliance protocols, the ignored warnings, the cascading failures that had destroyed a billion-dollar deal. But the real bombshell came in paragraph 7. Sources indicate that previous compliance leadership had implemented specific safeguards to prevent such failures, including automated liability assignment protocols that were triggered during the crisis. Automated liability assignment protocols. They'd found Error 401, my final gift to the system, the configuration that ensured Clause 17C would execute automatically when its conditions were met. No manual intervention required. No way to stop it once the countdown started. My phone began ringing. Reporters, former colleagues, even a few headhunters who'd suddenly remembered my existence. I ignored them all. This wasn't my story anymore. It was Mason's. That night I sat on my deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of justice. Somewhere in Seattle, Mason Drake was learning that innovation without foundation was just destruction by another name. The SEC would want answers. Shareholders would want blood. And Clause 17C would ensure he couldn't pass the blame to anyone else. Janice Patel's fingers trembled as she attached the file to the email. The recipient list was short, but devastating. Robert Steinberg, chairman of the board. Not Thomas Drake, the CEO who'd orchestrated my dismissal. Not the executives who'd cheered Mason's innovation. Straight to the top where politics couldn't provide cover. I learned about the email 3 days later when Jennifer called, whispering from a conference room. Claire, you won't believe what happened. Janice sent something directly to Steinberg. The entire executive floor is in chaos. Emergency board meetings, lawyers everywhere. They're saying she found something called a trigger match. Critical trigger match. The exact phrase I'd embedded in the system to flag when Clause 17C activated. Janice had done more than find documentation. She'd discovered the automated audit trail showing the clause had executed perfectly, transferring all merger liability to Mason Drake at 2:17 a.m. on June 22nd. Good for her, I said simply. But Claire, there's more. Thomas Drake tried to have her escorted out, but Steinberg overruled him. He's protecting her, saying she's a crucial witness for the board's investigation. Of course he was. Robert Steinberg hadn't built his fortune by ignoring smoking guns, and Janice had just handed him an arsenal. The next morning, my lawyer Margaret called with news that made me set down my coffee carefully. "Claire, I just received a very interesting call from Steinberg's personal attorney. The board is conducting an independent investigation into the merger failure. They want to depose you." "Depose me, I'm not being sued." "Not yet. This is a protective move. They want your testimony on record before the SEC gets to you. More importantly, they want to understand exactly how Clause 17C works." "It works exactly as documented," I said. Margaret laughed. "Yes, but they're hoping you might provide context that could shift liability back to the company rather than to Mason personally." "There is no context that would do that. The clause is clear, the approval chain is documented, and the trigger conditions were met. Mason Drake is personally liable for the merger failure." "Which is what I told them. They're still requesting your cooperation." I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Set it up. Full immunity, my choice of location, and a court reporter present. Already negotiated all of that, plus they're covering my fees." The deposition was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 a.m. in a neutral law firm's offices. I spent the weekend reviewing every document, every email, every piece of evidence that connected to Clause 17C. Not because I needed to refresh my memory, but because I wanted to savor the perfection of how it had all come together. Monday arrived gray and misty. I dressed carefully professional but not flashy confident, but not arrogant. Margaret met me in the lobby, her expression predatory. "Ready to explain how you legitimately destroyed a man's career?" she asked. "I didn't destroy anything. I just made sure the building codes were followed. If the building fell down, that's on the architect who ignored them." The conference room was packed. Robert Steinberg sat at the head of the table, his famous poker face giving away nothing. Beside him were 3 other board members, 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, and Harvey Brightman looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. "Ms. Morrison," Steinberg began without preamble, "thank you for agreeing to speak with us. We need to understand the mechanism by which Mr. Drake became personally liable for the merger failure." I nodded to the court reporter, waited for her signal, then began. Clause 17C was drafted in March of this year, following the failed Brennan Industries merger. The clause was designed to prevent last-minute changes in integration leadership that could allow responsible parties to evade accountability. "And this clause specifically names Mr. Drake?" one of the lawyers asked. "No. The clause applies to anyone holding the position of integration officer. Mr. Drake assumed that role voluntarily with full access to all documentation regarding its responsibilities and liabilities. But surely he couldn't have anticipated. Page 73 of my transition documentation specifically highlights Clause 17C as requiring strategic review. The email trail shows Mr. Drake received this documentation. Whether he chose to read it is not my responsibility." Steinberg leaned forward. "Ms. Morrison, did you create this clause specifically to trap Mr. Drake?" I met his gaze steadily. "I created this clause 9 months before I knew Mr. Drake would be integration officer. I created it to protect Triarch Systems from the exact scenario that just played out, a failed merger due to compliance failures with no clear accountability. But the automatic trigger mechanism was added on my last day, yes, using my legitimate system access to properly configure board-approved protocols. The configuration ensures the clause executes as designed, preventing any attempt to circumvent its provisions through last-minute personnel changes." Harvey finally spoke up. "You knew Mason would fail." "I knew that someone who called 12 years of compliance infrastructure operational minutia might encounter challenges, but Mr. Drake had every opportunity to succeed. He had comprehensive documentation experienced staff willing to help and clear warnings about critical protocols. He chose to ignore all of that. The Innovation Lab's assessment suggested your systems were overcomplicated, another board member said. Margaret smoothly slid a document across the table. The Innovation Lab's assessment was conducted by 2 junior employees with a combined 3 years of experience, neither in compliance. Their recommendation to eliminate redundant protocols directly caused 17 of the 23 critical failures identified by the SEC. The room fell silent. I continued, voice steady. Every system I built had a purpose. Every protocol existed because somewhere at some time its absence had caused a problem. When Mr. Drake eliminated these safeguards in the name of innovation, he removed the very things preventing catastrophic failure. But the merger could have succeeded, Harvey insisted, if you had consulted, if you had helped. Mr. Drake called me on June 15th requesting my help. I declined, as was my right as a private citizen with no obligation to Triarch Systems. I also note that his request specifically excluded bringing me back as integration officer, suggesting he understood the implications of Clause 17C. Steinberg's poker face finally cracked, showing a hint of smile. So he knew about the clause. The email trail suggests he became aware of it when the problem started. His attempt to bring in a replacement from McKinsey was blocked by legal precisely because it would have triggered the clause. He was trapped by his own title, unable to abandon the role without accepting liability. And if he'd simply done the job properly, one of the board members asked, then the merger would have succeeded and Clause 17C would have remained dormant. It only activates when someone tries to change integration officers within 10 days of the final audit. Mr. Drake triggered it by attempting to resign. After the failures had already occurred, Margaret added helpfully, the clause doesn't create liability, it simply ensures it can't be evaded. The deposition continued for 3 more hours. They asked about every detail, every decision, every moment leading up to the collapse. I answered truthfully, completely, and without emotion. The facts spoke for themselves. As we wrapped up, Steinberg asked, "One final question. Ms. Morrison, do you take any satisfaction in Mr. Drake's downfall?" I considered the question carefully. Mr. Steinberg, I spent 12 years building systems to protect this company. Those systems were dismissed as outdated, my expertise mocked as operational thinking. What I take satisfaction in is that my work did exactly what it was designed to do, assign accountability where it belongs. The fact that Mr. Drake is facing consequences for his decisions isn't personal satisfaction, it's professional validation. The court reporter finished typing, the lawyers gathered their papers, and the board members filed out silently. Only Steinberg remained studying me with those famous eyes that had built an empire. "We should have valued what we had," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." Margaret and I left the building together, stepping into afternoon sunshine that had burned through the morning mist. "That was masterful," she said. "They have nothing. No grounds to challenge the clause, no way to shift liability back to the company. Mason Drake is personally on the hook for everything." "He wanted to be strategic," I said. "Sometimes the most strategic thing you can do is recognize the value of solid operations." The news broke that evening. Business Insider ran with board investigation confirms personal liability in Triarch merger collapse. The article detailed how a properly implemented compliance clause had functioned exactly as designed, preventing corporate executives from evading responsibility for their failures. Mason Drake was quoted as calling the situation a betrayal of corporate innovation and punishing forward-thinking leadership, but his protests rang hollow against the federal investigation's findings, each one tracing back to his deliberate dismantling of critical safeguards. I turned off the news and returned to my garden. The tomatoes were coming in nicely, each plant carefully staked and supported. Not innovative, not strategic, just solid operational work that would bear fruit when the time came. My phone buzzed with a text from Janice. "Thank you for teaching me that documentation matters. Also, the board just offered me Director of Compliance." I smiled, typing back, "Congratulations. Remember, you're not there to be liked. You're there to keep them safe, especially from themselves." "Understood. Also, Ms. Morrison, Clause 17C is now being called the Morrison Protocol internally. They're keeping it active for all future mergers. The Morrison Protocol. 12 years reduced to a cardboard box, but my legacy lived on in code and clauses protecting the company despite itself. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying what hurt you, it's letting your work speak for itself long after you're gone." I put my phone away and returned to my plants. Tomorrow there would be more calls, more offers, more opportunities. But tonight, I was just Claire Morrison tending my garden, watching things grow at their own operational pace. Strategic thinking had its place, but in the end, it was the operational details that kept the world turning. The boardroom at Triarch Systems had seen better days. The mahogany table that once gleamed with power now reflected the harsh fluorescent lights of federal oversight. It was Monday, July 10th, 9 a.m. sharp, and the emergency board meeting was about to begin. I wasn't there, of course, but Jennifer, now working directly for the board's crisis management team, kept me informed with the dedication of someone who'd learned the value of operational thinking the hard way. "Claire, you should see this place," she'd told me the night before. "FBI boxes everywhere. They've seized so many computers that it is running systems on backup servers from 2019, the ones you insisted we maintain for catastrophic failure scenarios. Even in exile, my paranoia was keeping them afloat." The meeting itself, as Jennifer recounted later, was a massacre in slow motion. Robert Steinberg sat at the head of the table, flanked by federal investigators who'd made themselves comfortable in what used to be executive territory. The board members filed in like defendants approaching sentencing. Thomas Drake looked haggard, his usual CEO polish worn down to bare metal. Mason Drake sat beside him, though the body language screamed distance. Father and son united in name, but divided by the legal chasm Clause 17C had opened between them. "Gentlemen, ladies," Steinberg's voice could have frosted glass, "let's dispense with pleasantries. We're here to determine the full scope of liability exposure from the failed Orionics merger." The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Hendricks, who looked like she ate corporate executives for breakfast, opened a file thick enough to stop bullets. "Mr. Drake, Mason Drake, as integration officer, you made 17 separate decisions to override or eliminate compliance protocols. Each one is documented here." She began reading. Not summaries, not highlights, but the actual emails where Mason had dismissed concerns, mocked safeguards, ordered the deletion of legacy redundancies. His own words thrown back at him with the weight of federal law behind them. June 2nd, 11:43 a.m. "These validation protocols are Stone Age thinking. Delete them." June 5th, 3:22 p.m. "If Morrison thought this was necessary, that's reason enough to eliminate it." June 7th, 9:15 a.m. "Stop asking about edge cases. We're building for the 99%, not the paranoid 1%. Each quote landed like a hammer blow. The paranoid 1% that would be the scenarios that had ultimately destroyed the merger. Harvey Brightman tried to interject. These communications were internal strategy discussions. Taking them out of context. The context, Hendricks cut him off, is that each eliminated protocol led directly to a compliance failure. "We're not talking about strategy, Mr. Brightman. We're talking about willful negligence." Then came the moment everyone had been dreading. Steinberg pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it like a weapon. "This is Clause 17C from our merger protocols. Mr. Mason Drake, were you aware of this clause when you accepted the position of integration officer?" Mason shifted in his seat. "I was made aware of it later." "How much later?" "When complications arose with the integration." "So you knew about it before you attempted to bring in a replacement from McKinsey?" Trap laid. Trap sprung. Yes. "And you understood that changing integration officers would trigger personal liability transfer?" Harvey tried again. "Mr. Chairman, the interpretation of that clause is crystal clear," Steinberg finished. "I've had 3 independent legal reviews. Each one confirms that Clause 17C operates exactly as written. Mr. Mason Drake, as integration officer at the time of failure, bears personal liability for all compliance violations." The SEC representative spoke up. "Our preliminary assessment shows damages exceeding $400 million. That's before penalties, before lawsuits from Orionics, before shareholder actions." $400 million. The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Thomas Drake finally found his voice. "Surely the company insurance specifically excludes willful negligence," Hendricks noted. "Your son's emails demonstrate a pattern of deliberately ignoring risk warnings. No insurance company will touch this. This is insane. Mason exploded, his strategic composure finally cracking. I was innovating. I was modernizing. You can't hold me personally responsible for trying to drag this company into the future. Steinberg's response was surgical. We're not holding you responsible for innovation, Mr. Drake. We're holding you responsible for the consequences of ignoring 12 years of carefully constructed safeguards. Safeguards that were explained to you in detail by Ms. Morrison's documentation. Documentation I was told was outdated and irrelevant. Toss. Told by whom? Steinberg's question hung there poisonous. Mason's eyes flickered to his father. Just for a moment, but everyone saw it. I see, Steinberg continued. So you're suggesting the CEO instructed you to ignore compliance protocols. The trap was exquisite. Either Mason took full responsibility, or he implicated his father in the conspiracy to dismantle compliance. Either way, someone was going down. Thomas Drake saw it too. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. My son makes his own decisions. I gave him autonomy to run his department as he saw fit. And there it was. Father cutting son loose to save himself. The boardroom collectively held its breath. Mason's voice, when it came, was hollow. I made the decisions. I authorized the changes. I believed they were necessary for progress. Then you accept personal responsibility for the consequences, Steinberg pressed. Harvey made one last attempt. Mr. Chairman, perhaps we could explore restructuring the liability, finding a way to… No. The voice was Mason's, defeated now. I know what Clause 17C says. I know what I signed. I accept responsibility. But Steinberg wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the board. There's one more matter. The board has voted unanimously to pursue full recovery of damages from the responsible parties. Given Clause 17C's clear assignment of liability, that means you, Mr. Drake, the company will seek to recover every dollar of loss, every penalty, every legal fee. That could be everything I have, more than everything. Yes, Steinberg agreed simply. It could. The meeting continued for another hour, but the execution was complete. Mason Drake, the strategic visionary, who'd mocked operational thinking, was about to learn that innovation without foundation wasn't innovation at all. It was just expensive destruction. As the meeting wound down, Hendricks added one final twist of the knife. Mr. Drake, we'll need you to remain available for ongoing investigations. International travel is not advised. Your assets may be subject to freezing orders. From corner office to potential bankruptcy in 6 weeks. The fall was Shakespearean in its completeness. But the real revelation came in the meeting's final minutes. Janice Patel, newly appointed Director of Compliance, presented her initial findings from the system restoration. I've been reviewing Ms. Morrison's original architecture, she reported. If we can restore the eliminated protocols, and I believe we can thanks to her comprehensive documentation, we might salvage part of the Orionics relationship. Not the full merger, but perhaps a strategic partnership. Steinberg leaned forward. How long? 6 months to full restoration. But here's the remarkable thing Ms. Morrison built in recovery protocols. She actually anticipated someone might dismantle the system and created pathways to rebuild. It's all here in what she labeled catastrophic failure recovery procedures. Even in absentia, I was still protecting them from themselves. The meeting adjourned at 11:45. Mason Drake was led out by his lawyers, his father avoiding eye contact, his future destroyed by his own arrogant certainty that operational details didn't matter. Jennifer called me an hour later with the full report. I listened while making lunch, chopping vegetables with the same precision I'd once applied to compliance frameworks. The best part, Jennifer said, was when Steinberg asked why no one had listened to your warnings. The whole room went silent. Then Thomas Drake said, because we thought we were smarter than the system. The system always wins, I noted, adding carrots to my soup. That's why you build it carefully. Are you going to come back? Steinberg hinted they'd offer you whatever you wanted. I considered it, stirring the pot slowly. No, they need to live with their choices for a while. Janice will do fine. She's learned the most important lesson: document everything, trust nothing, and always have a clause 17C. That evening, I received an email that made me pour an especially good glass of wine. It was from Robert Steinberg himself, brief and to the point. Ms. Morrison, the board owes you an apology and a debt. Your systems worked exactly as designed, protecting the company even after we failed to protect you. If you ever want to return, name your terms. If not, know that the Morrison Protocol will remain active in perpetuity, a reminder that operational excellence matters. R. Steinberg. I didn't reply. Some messages were better left to speak for themselves. Outside my window, Seattle's skyline glittered in the twilight. Somewhere in that forest of glass and steel, Mason Drake was learning that when you called someone expired software, you'd better make sure you understood what that software actually did. Because sometimes the old code is the only thing keeping the system from crashing. And when it does crash, Clause 17C ensures you can't blame the programmer who tried to warn you. I raised my glass to the city lights, to operational thinking, to documentation, to the beautiful, terrible precision of consequences delivered exactly as specified. The system always wins. That's why you build it right the first time. The collapse happened in real-time broadcast across every business network like a corporate execution. Tuesday, July 18th, 2:30 p.m. Eastern. CNBC broke the story that would become the final nail in Mason Drake's professional coffin. Breaking news from the Triarch Orionics merger failure, the anchor announced. Internal documents reveal that automated compliance systems triggered what insiders are calling the most devastating liability transfer in corporate history. I was reviewing consulting offers when the news broke. 23 companies had reached out since the story went public, each one suddenly very interested in robust compliance architecture and catastrophic failure prevention. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very operational thinking they'd all dismissed 6 months ago was now worth its weight in gold. My phone buzzed. Marcus from legal, his text simply reading, "Check your email. Official board communication." The email was a masterpiece of corporate communication signed by Robert Steinberg himself. Notice of automatic compliance protocol activation, Clause 17C. At 2:17 a.m. PST, on June 22, 2025, Triarch Systems' automated compliance monitoring system registered a critical trigger event. Per established protocols approved by the Board of Directors on March 30, 2025, Integration Officer succession within the restricted window activated immediate liability transfer mechanisms. This transfer is irrevocable, personally binding, superseding of all indemnification agreements, automatically enforced by system parameters. Current liability status. Integration Officer, Mason Drake. Personal liability exposure, 437, 293 AO, 847. Additional penalties, pending TBD, criminal investigation, active. The board acknowledges that all systems functioned exactly as designed and documented. $437 million, plus penalties, plus potential criminal charges. The number was so large it ceased to be real money and became pure consequence. Jennifer called within minutes. "Claire, it's chaos here. Mason just got served with asset freezing orders. They're saying he tried to transfer money to offshore accounts, but the system flagged it." Of course it did. Another gift from my paranoid operational thinking: automated alerts for unusual executive financial activity during merger windows. I'd built it after watching too many executives golden parachute their way out of disasters they'd created. What about Thomas Drake? Suspended pending investigation. The board found emails where he explicitly instructed Mason to eliminate Morrison's bureaucratic obstacles. His lawyer is claiming he meant it metaphorically. Metaphorically, as if federal investigators cared about literary interpretation. The real-time destruction continued through the afternoon. Financial networks ran split screens, Triarch's stock price plummeting on one side, Mason Drake's LinkedIn profile being deleted on the other. Someone had leaked his final email to staff sent at 1:47 p.m. Team, The reports of my personal liability are accurate but taken out of context. I remain confident that my innovative approach to compliance modernization was correct. Traditional thinking may have won this battle, but history will vindicate those brave enough to challenge outdated systems. MD. Outdated systems. Even facing bankruptcy and possible prison, he couldn't admit that maybe. Just maybe some things existed for good reasons. The dashboard screenshots started appearing on Twitter by 3 p.m. Some enterprising employee had captured the moment Clause 17C activated in the system. The visual was stark, a cascade of red alerts, automatic ownership transfers, liability assignments, flowing like digital blood from the company to Mason Drake personally. The timestamp was damning 2:17 a.m. June 22nd. The exact moment Mason's resignation attempt triggered the clause. The system had executed perfectly, documenting every step, creating an audit trail that would stand up in any court. But the true poetry came from the technical logs. Brad from the Innovation Lab, apparently developing a conscience, leaked the system messages to TechCrunch. Critical Clause 17C trigger condition met action. Initiating liability transfer protocol. Target. Current integration officer, Drake M. Status. Transfer complete. Rollback. Disabled per board mandate. Notification sent to legal board, SEC timestamp, 2025-06-22, 02-17-33, PST. Executed by Automated Compliance System, V12.3, Morrison Architecture. Morrison Architecture. My code executing my logic, delivering my justice. The phone rang. Margaret, my lawyer, sounding gleeful. Claire, I just got off a call with the federal prosecutor. They want to know if you'd be willing to testify about the systematic dismantling of compliance protocols. Testify against whom? Everyone. Mason, obviously. But they're also looking at Thomas Drake, the board members who approved the dismantling, even the Innovation Lab kids who recommended eliminating safeguards. I considered it. What's my exposure? 0. You documented everything, warned everyone, and left before any violations occurred. If anything, you're their star witness. The prosecutor actually said, and I quote, Ms. Morrison built a better case than we could have. By 4 p.m., the avalanche was complete. The SEC announced formal charges. The FBI confirmed criminal investigation for willful violation of federal compliance requirements. Orionics publicly withdrew from all negotiations and announced they were suing for damages caused by Triarch's misrepresentation of their integration capabilities. The final indignity came from an unexpected source. At 4:47 p.m., the Association of Corporate Compliance Professionals issued a statement. The Triarch system's failure represents a cautionary tale for all organizations. When experienced compliance leadership is dismissed as operational, rather than strategic, catastrophic failure, becomes not just possible but probable. We note that the automated systems that ultimately assigned liability were built by the very executive whose expertise was deemed outdated. The Morrison Protocol should serve as a reminder that in compliance, paranoia is just another word for experience. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Offers, congratulations, interview requests. I ignored them all, instead focusing on the email that had arrived at 3:15 p.m. It was from Janice Patel, brief but powerful. Ms. Morrison, the system you built just saved this company from complete destruction. By clearly assigning liability, you prevented the SEC from pursuing broader charges against all employees. Mason Drake will face consequences, but hundreds of innocent employees keep their jobs. That's the real victory. Thank you for building something that protected us, even when we didn't protect you. Janice. P.S. I'm implementing Morrison Protocol 2.0. It includes a clause that prevents any compliance officer from being dismissed as too operational. We're calling it the Experience Preservation Mandate. I smiled, pouring myself a coffee. Outside, Seattle's afternoon rain had started washing the city clean. Somewhere across town, Mason Drake was watching his world collapse in real time, brought down by the very systems he'd mocked. The news cycle continued its feeding frenzy. A leaked photo showed federal agents carrying boxes from Mason's office. Another caught him leaving his attorney's building looking haggard and defeated. The strategic visionary who'd dismissed operational thinking as outdated was learning that gravity didn't care if you believed in innovation. My computer dinged with a new email. The sender made me pause Thomas Drake's personal account. Claire, I know I have no right to contact you. What we did was wrong. What I let happen was worse. My son is facing ruin because I encouraged his arrogance and dismissed your expertise. I've lost my company, my reputation, and my son's future. You have every right to feel vindicated. But I need you to know your systems didn't just assign liability. They revealed truth. We were the emperors with no clothes, and you were the only one honest enough to document it. I'm sorry. Thomas. I read it twice, then archived it without responding. Some apologies came too late to matter. The final tally came in at 6 p.m. Bloomberg's headline said it all: Triarch merger failure, 437 M. Personal liability sets corporate record. The article detailed how Clause 17C had functioned flawlessly, how the automated systems had executed exactly as designed, how one woman's operational paranoia had created the most perfect corporate accountability mechanism ever deployed. They interviewed various experts, all now singing the praises of robust compliance architecture. The same people who'd spent years pushing agile compliance and innovative risk management were suddenly advocates for careful documentation and systematic safeguards. The Morrison Protocol represents the evolution of compliance, one expert noted. It's not about preventing innovation, it's about ensuring consequences follow those who innovate recklessly. As evening fell, I closed my laptop and walked to my window. The city sparkled below its lights, reflecting off rain-wet streets. Tomorrow there would be more offers, more vindication, more proof that operational thinking mattered. But tonight I was content to stand here, coffee in hand, watching the world learn a lesson I'd tried to teach gently. When gentle didn't work, I'd let them learn it hard. $437 million hard. The system had executed perfectly just as I'd designed it. Not out of malice, but out of the simple belief that actions should have consequences and expertise should be valued. Mason Drake had called me expired software. But in the end, it was my code that compiled my systems that executed and my protocols that delivered justice with mechanical precision. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal. It's systematic. The email from Robert Steinberg arrived on a Thursday morning in September, 3 months after the merger collapsed. The subject line was simple: Consulting opportunity, your terms. I was in my cabin in Vermont, having decided that distance from Seattle would do me good. The morning mist rolled through the pines as I opened the message on my laptop, coffee steaming beside me on the deck. Ms. Morrison, the dust has settled. The lessons have been learned. Triarch needs rebuilding, and we need someone who understands that foundations matter more than facades. Name your price, your terms, your conditions. The board has given me complete authority to bring you back however you see fit. Robert Steinberg. I set the laptop aside and watched the sun burn through the fog. 3 months ago, this email would have meant everything. Now I had choices. My phone rang. Jennifer, now Senior Director of Compliance Operations under Janice. Claire, did you see the news? Mason Drake just pled guilty to 17 counts of willful compliance violation. He's looking at 3 to 5 years. I hadn't seen it, I said, though I wasn't surprised. The federal prosecutors had built an airtight case, helped considerably by the audit trail my systems had created. But here's the real news: Thomas Drake resigned from all his board positions. Rumor is he's liquidating assets to help pay Mason's liabilities, trying to save his son from complete ruin. A father's last act of protection. Too little, too late, but more than Mason probably deserved. There's something else, Jennifer continued. Steinberg's been telling everyone that bringing you back is his top priority. He actually said in the all-hands meeting that firing you was the biggest strategic error in company history. I smiled at that. Strategic error. Even in admitting mistakes, they couldn't help but frame everything in their preferred language. That afternoon, I composed my response to Steinberg. Not a rejection, but not acceptance either. Something more interesting. Mr. Steinberg, I appreciate your offer. However, Triarch doesn't need me. You have Janice Patel, who understands the importance of operational excellence. You have systems that, despite attempts at destruction, prove their resilience. What Triarch needs is not my return, but a commitment to valuing the unglamorous work that keeps companies alive. Instead of returning as an employee, I propose something different. I'll establish Morrison Compliance Consulting, specializing in building Clause 17C frameworks for companies wise enough to want them. Triarch can be my first client, but not my only one. My terms are simple. I work remotely, I choose my projects, and I never again hear the phrase "too operational" used as an insult. If this interests you, I'll be in Seattle next month. Coffee is on you. Claire Morrison. I sent it at 2:15 p.m., then went for a hike. The Vermont woods were peaceful, a world away from corporate boardrooms and federal investigations. But I wasn't hiding. I was building something new. The response came within an hour. Deal. Name the date. RS. Over the following weeks, I formally established Morrison Compliance Consulting. My first hire was surprising Brad from the Innovation Lab. He'd called humbled and honest. Ms. Morrison, I was wrong. About everything. I thought disruption meant destruction. You showed me it could mean building something so solid that even idiots couldn't break it completely. If you're willing, I'd like to learn the right way. Everyone deserved a second chance to learn. Even Innovation Lab bros who'd once mocked PDFs. By October, I had 6 clients and a waiting list. Every company suddenly wanted their own Clause 17C, their own Morrison protocol. They wanted systems that would save them from themselves, frameworks that would assign accountability before it was too late to matter. The real satisfaction came from the implementation meetings. CEOs who'd once dismissed compliance as a cost center now sat attentively as I explained why every safeguard mattered. They took notes when I discussed operational thinking. They nodded when I insisted on documentation. Fear was a powerful teacher, and Mason Drake's downfall had taught them plenty to fear. I kept the cabin in Vermont but traveled monthly to Seattle. Janice and I would have coffee discussing the restoration of Triarch's systems. She'd successfully rebuilt most of what Mason had destroyed using my documentation as a blueprint. The funny thing, she told me during one visit, is that the systems are actually stronger now. We understand not just how they work, but why they exist. Every protocol has a story, a failure it prevents. Mason's disaster became our education. The epilogue to Mason's story came in December. He'd been sentenced to 4 years eligible for parole in 2. The financial penalties had consumed everything: his assets, his trust fund, his future. The strategic visionary who'd mocked operational thinking would spend the next several years in the most operational environment imaginable, federal prison. Thomas Drake sent me a final email before disappearing from public life entirely. You gave us every warning. We chose not to listen. I hope others learn from our arrogance. Thank you for building systems that protected the innocent even as they exposed the guilty. On a snowy evening in my Vermont cabin, I sat by the fire with my laptop putting the finishing touches on my book, The Morrison Protocol: Why Operational Excellence Matters More Than Strategic Vision. Publishers were bidding aggressively, sensing a market hungry for wisdom about sustainable business practices. The dedication was simple. To everyone who's been called too operational, you're the ones who keep the world running. As I saved the final chapter, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message made me laugh out loud. Ms. Morrison, starting new position as compliance officer at tech startup. Day 1 CEO called compliance necessary evil. Showed him article about Mason Drake. He immediately approved my budget. Thank you for making our jobs easier. A grateful colleague. The fire crackled. Snow fell softly outside, and somewhere in Seattle the systems I'd built continued their patient work. Watching, documenting, waiting to deliver consequences to those who thought themselves above accountability. Mason Drake had called me expired software, dismissed my work as operational minutiae thought. He could innovate away the need for careful foundations. But in the end, it was my code that executed flawlessly my paranoia that proved prescient, my boring operational thinking that delivered justice with mechanical precision. The best revenge wasn't destroying those who'd wronged you. It was building something so solid, so well documented, so thoroughly integrated, that it would outlive both your presence and your absence. It was creating systems that protected the innocent and exposed the guilty that functioned perfectly whether you were there to run them or not. I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of wine from a very good bottle, a gift from Janice when she'd gotten her promotion. Outside the Vermont woods stood silent under fresh snow, but I wasn't alone. Around the country in boardrooms and compliance departments, people were learning that operational thinking wasn't the enemy of innovation. It was the foundation that made innovation possible. And somewhere in a federal facility, Mason Drake was learning that the hard way. Every day for the next 4 years. I raised my glass to the falling snow, to Clause 17C, to the beauty of consequences delivered exactly as specified. Sometimes the best revenge is just doing your job so well that years later your work is still protecting people and still destroying those who deserve it. The Morrison Protocol. May it outlive us all. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and the triumph of operational thinking. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Share your thoughts on Claire's journey and whether you've ever encountered a Mason Drake in your own workplace. If you enjoyed this tale of justice served cold through perfectly documented protocols, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And don't forget to hit the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories of clever revenge and poetic justice. Until next time, remember, document everything.